Welcome back to the Swamp 24/7 podcast. I'm your host, Thomas Goldcamp, along with my co-hosts, Brett DioGuardi and Blake Alderman. Guys, Florida obviously in a tough spot this season. Really have been trying to find ways to kind of staunch the bleeding, so to speak, ever since really that Kentucky game. And the Gators just, for whatever reason, haven't been able to turn things around. I think a lot of people felt like last week against Samford, maybe even the week before against South Carolina, started to show maybe a sign that, guys were checking out mentally. Brett, I know at one point you mentioned on this show the concern was going to be a lot of guys are thinking about their future, thinking about the NFL. That's always a concern, and keeping guys mentally locked in was going to be a challenge. In my mind, Florida hasn't really been able to figure that out. I'm not quite sure why, but I think yesterday's game against Missouri is kind of confusing because it's like the total opposite of what happened against Samford. I guess, Brett, were you surprised by that? Because the defense gets panned all last week for not showing up, and then they come out and play a pretty good game, and it's like, this time it's the offense and special teams letting them down.
Yeah, to be honest, I was a little surprised because it was a strong start defensively, especially in the trenches. Like, they were shutting down Tyler Beatty early on in the game, and it looked way more reminiscent of like that Alabama game and those early games on where we were dominating in the trenches. And then as the game went on, it seemed like some more wear and tear that, Mizzou's offensive line was able to control the line of scrimmage, especially, in the second half. That kind of helped them to, and then they never really separated themselves because Florida's defense kept them in the game the whole time. But I feel like that quarterback for Missouri really didn't have it, in him to win the game on his own. So if they were able to continue and shut down Beatty in that run game, they would have won the game, pretty easily versus, Mizzou's offense. The line of scrimmage got dominated by them. Beatty, has like, I don't know, 3 or 4 runs of like 25 plus yards or something around the lines of that. And then completely changes the game, gives them way more momentum. The fans get into it on senior night. And ultimately, I mean, I was surprised with how they came out, though. It didn't look like they, Mullen and staff has lost them with how they came out. Compared to versus Samford, they came out just sluggish. Defense looked to not really know what they're doing. Maybe that's because Robinson got another full week with that defense, try to like work on some scheme stuff. But in general, I was surprised how they came out defensively to start the game.
Blake, to me, it seems like this Florida team in particular, and I've seen this happen with teams in the past. 2013, it kind of happened a little bit, not to maybe the same degree. 2017, I think it happened. But when you have a team in a situation where its back's kind of against the wall, the pressure outside is obvious. I mean, everybody's talking about Dan Mullen, where the program's at in year 4. To me, it seems like players kind of take on, individually at least, here and there, this mentality of, well, we're doing everything we can. And I think that's kind of what you saw on defense. We're doing everything we can. And then it's like the offense just can't get anything going. Same thing happened kind of the other way against Samford a little bit. And unless one unit kind of steps up and just takes over, like completely takes over, then eventually it just feels like you're waiting for the other team to kind of land that punch. And it felt like Missouri, to Brett's point, Missouri just hung around long enough because Florida couldn't get anything going on offense. And all of a sudden the crowd gets back into it. And sure enough, the momentum goes against Florida. How much of that do you think, Blake, is just guys are kind of at the point where they're either expecting bad things to happen or, they're just checked out?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think some of those guys, that maybe have NFL aspirations or, they're starting to think about, their future. I think those things, I think that they just probably have a lot on their mind. They're obviously on social media. They're reading all the talks about, will Dan Mullen be here? Will he not be there? Is he not the guy? All those things I think are probably a culmination of, we're going out there, we're trying to make plays. And yes, do I need to start thinking about my future? Am I going to take some plays off? Because that's what I thought about for the Samford game. You look on defense, you saw them come out and have a better second half than the first half. But there was just so many plays where you see a guy that maybe was running across the field to make a play and he kind of pulls up. Those types of things are where you start to see some of those guys start to check out. But, I think they played a lot better, a lot more energized on defense against Missouri. I think they came out well. It's just one of those things, man, where I feel like every week, you're waiting to see if Florida's going to play a complete game, and they're just not. Special teams has been, kind of their Achilles heel all year. And this year, the offense just couldn't make enough plays to pull ahead.
What do you guys make of the fact that it seems like it's something different every week?
Man, I don't know if it's just something that's just undisciplined. You look at a lot of the penalties that add up there. Those are undisciplined things. For me, it's just, it's kind of to your point where you're waiting for that one side of the ball to kind of take over and do it. No one wants to take the initiative to come out and dominate and, get whatever they need to do through. And I feel like that's a lack of discipline.
Yeah. And then also it just seems like not a sense of like wholeness within the team. If you got to have the offense depending on the defense. And that's kind of like how it's been, to be honest, the past however many years of Florida when it was Muschamp, the defense, the offense always relied on the defense because you knew you had a dominant defense. Then my last year playing there, obviously we couldn't get a stop defensively. So it's like the defense was relying on the offense constantly. And it seems like it's just been an issue within Florida. Special teams has always been pretty solid, especially as of like the past few years. But in general, it's like, why do we always have to have the offense putting up 35 points because our defense can't get a stop versus in the time before I got there, our defense with Muschamp was pretty dominant, but our offense could never get points on the board. And I agree with Blake too. One of the notes I wrote down was the penalties. They're killer. I mean, 9 penalties for 80 yards speaks for itself. But on top of that, like, I love Mahmoud. The guy's aggressive, and I'm not saying anything against him because he's a great player. But that offsides and the neutral zone infraction right before half is just something that kind of kills momentum. And then Trey Dean with that pass interference late. I could be wrong, but these are just the type of issues throughout my time at Florida where we make those kind of like boneheaded plays that I could be wrong, but I just don't see someone at Alabama making that type of play in a crucial part of a game or, an Ohio State or something. And I just feel like those little penalties seem like, small, but they turn into, a couple of games that are lost instead of being won. And that's the difference. It's so small between, an 11-1 year, obviously not this season in general, but I'm saying like those little penalties end up paying, dividends and how the season ends up being, 10-2 versus being, 8-4 or something like that.
Yeah. And I think, I do think there's something to be said for the fact that Florida probably isn't as bad as it has looked this year. I think some of that is a product of recruiting. I think when you are recruiting at the level Florida has been, which is roughly 5th, 6th in the SEC, obviously not there with this class anymore. But when you're recruiting at that level, you're in more of those games where one mistake can kind of be costly like that. And I think that's part of the bigger issue. I think losing Kyle Trask obviously was a big deal. I think Kyle Trask covered up a lot of things. I mean, and even he couldn't fully cover up the defense, to your point. So I think there just needs to be, I don't know, a better, more locked in approach across the board. But obviously at this point, guys, we're going to end up shifting the conversation a little bit because, this Missouri game was just the latest in a string of these kind of things. And the question at this point becomes, how do you get out of that? So, Brett, I want to ask you, because you've had experience with multiple different staffs. You've kind of gone through the turmoil of being a player, when things kind of go sour in the fan base and nationally, when, the national media is talking about you and laughing about Eli Drinkwitz kind of pulling out his lightsaber and these kind of things. It's not a good place to be in. What does that feel like as a player, and how does this maybe compare to 2017 when all that started to go south with Jim McElwain?
Well, I mean, one thing with social media and all the national spotlight is like, it's not like the players don't look at it, whether they try to or not. We see that kind of stuff. And, around this time is where you can lose your players. And, I wouldn't be against, saying that maybe some, players in the locker room have kind of lost their faith in Mullen, which, it's just tough. And like Blake said, too, you do have some of those guys that like have NFL aspirations, too, that start to think like, let's be honest, you're an 18 to 22-year-old male, trying to focus on your future and like providing for your family outside of just college football. So it's just a tough situation. And I can't say exactly what's going on inside, but I know like during that 2017 year, it was different because the head coach got fired. And that just, was like bowling ball of just a bunch of bad events. And then, you'd have players going at it with coaches, people lose, their faith in the coaching staff and stuff. I don't think that's completely happened still with having, Mullen there, but I know during my time at UF and, with what's happening right now, there's got to be a couple of guys that are thinking to themselves, like during our Alabama game last year, we kind of think of, why didn't we use or save that timeout instead of going for the 2-point conversion, little things like that, little moments like that. Why, the play calling before half, why when you have a minute left, and my buddy who's the kicker, Chris Howard, had his best game as a Gator. He's 3 for 3. He's got a big leg. I've seen him make, 50-yard plus, like 55 to 60-yard type field goals. Emory had a pretty solid game. Like you got a minute and 3 seconds left. The clock stops after every first down. You're telling me we don't have a 2-minute script that we can try to get down 40 yards from where we were at and give him a shot to kick a game winner. I think when something like that happens, it just deflates, you got a bunch of young guys that are, excited to try to win a ball game, regardless of how the seasons go. Because when the game's going on, I think players, and I know during my experience, they're able to channel in and like forget about that stuff. Because at the end of the day, you're a competitor and you're competing for, to win a game in the SEC. I think that kind of really rubs the guys the wrong way when you see that you're kind of just going to be complacent down the stretch and not give your guys an opportunity to win the game, especially, during Mullen's time. And when I was there, we've had situations where it's, 4th and 5, 4th and 7, and we don't send out our field goal kicker when we could have got points on the board. And that even happened earlier on in the game where we could have tried, a 40, it was like a 48-yard or something along the lines of that. Howard banged the 42, looked like a chip shot. And it's like, you got to take those points. And sometimes you got to try to put aside the, offensive mastermind, like, oh, I can convert this 4th and 7. Like, okay, that's great. But if you can, play the analytics game, if you can take the points when you can get them, and if you got a shot to try to drive down, I think if I'm Emory and there's a minute left and we do that, it kind of, I'm like, what, you don't think I have the skill set to get down 35 yards and give us a shot to win? I just think it's crazy because he's always been super aggressive. And then I even tweeted about it. It's like, in that type of situation, now you want to get complacent, which can lose, obviously the fan base, but in general, like that can rub the guys the wrong way that are out there on the field competing, thinking like, oh, we're going to go into overtime. Yeah, the offense looked good. We came down and drove and scored, but I love the call by Missouri to go for 2 there. All the stuff from last year's game, you got kind of head coaches butting heads and stuff, and then you got senior night at home to become bowl eligible, and you're going to go for 2 versus, with 1 minute and 3 left, just getting complacent and having 3 run calls. I don't know. It's definitely something like that can really lose some faith from players. I know that because everyone's got a competitive edge, and that's kind of just shutting down the opportunity to win the game there.
I think to me, what's odd about that is it seems very inconsistent in terms of approach from Dan Mullen. And I've always been a proponent of kind of what you're talking about is be aggressive in the right spots, right? Like the guys will feed on, hey, if it's a 4th and 1 and you tell your O-line, hey, it's on you to go get this. Like that's exactly what you're talking about is that competitor switch flips on you and it builds confidence, and then confidence builds more confidence. It's just strange that, Florida, this is the 2nd game in a row where they've had plenty of time, the Kentucky game being the other one, to push the ball down the field. The Kentucky one was even more egregious given the timeout situation and all that. But to me, like to your point, I completely agree. It seemed like you were telling Emory, I don't really have faith in you. Like you're calling a draw, trying to clear out the middle of the field. Granted, Naquan slips, I get it, but to me, it rings a little bit hollow in terms of the inconsistency of approach. Like there's guys don't necessarily know exactly when they're going to go for it, when they're going to try to kick, and then you're wondering why is he not kicking it because of me, and your kicker's question and things.
Oh yeah, for sure, that can kill a kicker's confidence. And one last thing I just want to say too is I get it, Naquan slipped, but why not try to draw up something like last year's Georgia game when you got the wheel routes with the running backs or some play action pass type stuff just to get a first down, get out of bounds, give yourself at least an opportunity to think about it. Because I get not wanting to give them a chance to go win it, but 1 minute and 3 seconds is like, you got the opportunity to go get a field goal there. I just didn't agree with it.
I'm with you. All right, guys. Well,
and I think it's one of those situations to where whenever you've got the confidence in your team to play, you play to win. And if you play not to lose, that just it just gets everyone slumped down. And I felt like that was a lot of the, kind of reminiscence of the Muschamp era. There was a lot of those games where he seems like he was playing not to lose. If you go out there and you push and you try to get some points on the board, I think that confidence builds up. And that's what this team needs. They need confidence. And I think that was something that was missing with that. I agree with everything you guys said in that point.
All right, well, Blake, I wanted to actually get to you on recruiting. Kind of, maybe we can take a quick break, and then we'll get back in the second half of the show. Talk about, where Florida's at right now, recruiting, whether or not this is kind of the end for Dan Mullen, or whether or not we think there's still a chance he can pull it out. But let's take a quick commercial break, and then we'll be right back. Welcome back to the Swamp 24/7 podcast. I'm Thomas Goldkamp here with Brett DioGuardi and Blake Alderman. Blake, I wanted to talk to you about recruiting because I brought this up really after the South Carolina game as one of the reasons why I thought things were probably too far gone already after that game, the way that Florida showed up in terms of effort, where the fan base was, or at least my sense of where the fan base was at that point in time. You have to be able to recruit to get yourself out of this. And, Florida, maybe you can win with a transcendent quarterback. Maybe Anthony Richardson turns into that guy. But for the most part, to be consistently competitive in the SEC, you and I both know that Florida's had to recruit a little bit better than they have so far. So if you're sitting at this and you're just hypothetically, you're Scott Strickland and, you're trying to convince yourself that there's some way that you should bring Dan Mullen back. There's some way you should be a little bit more patient with him, give him the chance to get in that new indoor practice facility, have recruits see that. How do you come up with a narrative that you can turn things around in recruiting? Because to me, it doesn't seem like that's going to be doable.
Do you want me to find one, or do you want me to? Because I don't think there is one either. Okay. But I mean, if you wanted to find the ways to do it, get some other staff members on there. I think it's always, I keep saying it's a trickle down effect because the head coach, I don't think it's that he doesn't care about recruiting. I think he does. I think he knows that, that you need good players. I think that that's pretty common knowledge around everyone. But I think Dan is one of those guys that thinks that he can coach up, maybe a developmental guy and turn him into a really good player, smartest person in the room type of thing, to where, well, this guy's just as good as this guy. I can coach him up and I can make him one of the, the best players out there. So I think that is all a factor in there. But, I mean, is the facility going to, change the fact that, coach doesn't seem to live and breathe and eat recruiting every day? No. I mean, is that going to, I've never had a player that says, oh man, this facility is really nice. This is why I'm coming to Florida. It's, relationships with, coaching staff. It's, the feel of, the kind of camaraderie around the team. It's just developmental things. Florida can get me and my family here and that, on to the next level with development and winning games. And that's just not something you can sell this year. So I think in general, is there a narrative? I don't think there really is one. I think if you bring in some of those assistants in there that are going to recruit and breathe and eat, and it kind of reminds me of Jim McElwain. Yes, he was struggling recruiting. Those years he was there, he was getting some players, but then he hires a guy like Jawan Sider. I think that kind of flips the script in general when you have one of those alpha recruiters, and that's just one guy. Mm-hmm. That 2019 class or whatever, or 2018 class that Florida had before they moved on from McElwain was really good. And that was in a year where there were a lot of questions at Florida. So I think if you get one of those alpha type recruiters, can it change can it change things around and you can kind of get, the recruiting build up back? I think it's possible, but you have to make the right type of hire. You need a Jawan Sider type of guy who's going to come in and just kill it on the recruiting trail. And I think if Florida gets some more of those types of guys, I think that could be something to watch in there. But again, it all falls on the head coach. I think Jim McElwain knew that was an area where he needed to get better at, and he took the initiative to get a guy like Jawan Sider in there. And that's something that Dan needs to take a look in the mirror and really kind of look at that. And that's something that I could see if you want to flip things around. But, will he do that? That's the question.
Well, here's one thing I'll say real quick. Yes, Jim McElwain did that, but he understood perception in the sense that he took some guys that Florida swore up and down they weren't going to take that were highly rated guys. Sure. What I'm talking about. Darius Lemons, James Robinson. Those are guys that Florida swore they weren't going to take, and they took literally on signing day to try to bolster the rankings. And right. I actually, does it change anything in the long run when those guys, aren't able to play or don't end up on the team? No. You're still in the same place. Is the ninth rated recruiting class any different than the 13th if it's based on two guys that don't end up playing? No. But he at least understood the perception. And I think that's one of the things that Dan Mullen's probably struggled with. When you're a head coach, that's kind of, you have to give that effort in all areas, right? And I think Dan Mullen is a great X's and O's coach on offense. I do think he's very smart. I think he's inconsistent there in terms of play calling, and we talked about some of that in the first half of the show. But that's kind of his one calling card, right? And if you're asking people, what else does Dan Mullen do well right now? Maybe I'll just ask Brett, because to me, that's far and away the number one thing. And when you don't have enough other things like recruiting, just that sense of always needing to be recruiting, that kind of thing, the ability to organize a staff that doesn't have issues with players here and there, that doesn't have issues with each other, that's where, I think things start to fall apart. But Brett, I don't know, maybe you can chime in on that, knowing Dan Mullen a little bit better than us.
Just being completely honest, I wish I was, had Blake's ability to immediately rattle off a way of fixing it that I may not see. Just one thing I wanted to add too was when you mentioned Sider, he was without a doubt, a player's favorite in the locker room, whether not just running backs, defensive side of the ball, everybody loved him. And I see a lot of similarities just in being able to relate to the players. Some of the guys that's on Mullen's staff and that are no longer there, and even a couple of guys that are still there, just aren't super inviting, I guess, to a recruit or to get someone these guys want to build a relationship. They almost want, a coach to feel like like an older brother to you that you want to go and play for, that you have a good relationship with. And Sider was like the best with that. And it's funny because I see a lot of similarities in Christian Robinson with Sider. That's why I think, for recruiting purposes, at least if Mullen's staying there, a guy like Robinson needs to have somewhat of a bigger platform just in the recruiting aspect, that like people want to come and play for him. Like, he's the type of guy that'll go, I play Warzone with C-Rob, like we'll play Xbox, he relates to his players. Like even the guys that he's not in his position group and stuff, and guys want to play for a guy like him. So I think Mullen really, like Blake said, needs to get some other people to add to his staff, because it's kind of being shown now that he can't do it all by himself. So that's what I would say is try to, be less egotistical, put your pride to the side and think like, if I'm really going to fix this, like who is going to help me, with recruiting? Because recruiting is everything now. I mean, it's great when you're developing players for, years to come, but in the SEC, when you got Alabama and Georgia and even like Tennessee's looking, even though we beat them, Tennessee's starting to look a lot better. South Carolina's becoming more relevant, with their new coaching staff. It's like, you got to be able to have players that are playing right now and have those guys that you're developing be, second and third teamers that eventually turn into that starter role junior, senior year. And that's been Mullen's huge approach, is like, you come in as a freshman, you're going to contribute maybe on some special teams. And if you travel, it's because of special teams. Your second year, a couple of plays on defense while doing special teams or on offense. Your third year, and it's like, I don't think he has the talent to be able to have that approach. So like, you need to attack recruiting, and you need to be able to have guys that can come in like CJ Henderson, my sophomore year, a guy that can come in and start, be a 3-year starter, NFL pick, early NFL pick. Like, you need to be able to go and get those guys. And in order to do that, you got to, like Blake said, get a like alpha male recruiter that's going to be able to recruit those guys and get them to buy into the system, given what's going on with Florida right now, because not a lot of recruits are seeing all the uncertainty. I'm like, oh, I'm going to be that guy to go change that. Like, especially in today's generation, a lot of these kids like want to go into a place where like, oh, I'm going to be first string. Oh, we got a shot at winning the Natty. Oh, I can win, my whatever position award there is. Like, no one wants to come into a situation where it's like, we don't know if coach is going to be here, but believe in us. Like, we want your best interest. Like, come on, how are you going to believe someone wants your best interest if they don't even know if they're going to be there, 6 months from now? So I think an alpha male recruiter is inevitable, like for Dan Mullen to have any type of success in the next, year or so. Insane.
Yeah, I think you made an interesting point there as far as the development cycle for players that come into the Florida program under Dan Mullen. And one of the things I had talked to a couple Mississippi State folks, beat writers that had covered Dan Mullen at State, when he was hired. And one of the things they pointed out was watch recruiting. And they said specifically junior college prospects on the O-line. In other words, this was before the transfer portal, but Mississippi State pretty regularly would have veteran lines. But they, if they ran into situations where they had a year where a couple veterans graduated, they were trying to, plug and play with JUCO guys. And that can work here and there, but I don't think it's a sustainable model. I think what we've seen to some degree is Florida's reliance on so many seniors and unwillingness to play freshmen younger in some ways hurts their development a little bit. But also, it's kind of like a patchwork approach where you're trying to grab guys from the portal, and there's just a lot more high school prospects, a lot more options of really top-notch players that if you're at a place like Florida, you should be able to go out and get via recruiting. Like, you shouldn't have to be trying to patch things, with 3 defensive tackles from the portal. And to me, that's a reflection of kind of the approach that's been there on recruiting. Blake, I don't know. I mean, we've talked about this a little bit, but how big is that in terms of part of the problem, and how do you fix that?
Talking about the portal and like relying on the portal? Just
the overall strategy, because I think like we've obviously praised Dan Mullen quite a bit for the portal when it works. I mean, they've gotten some
Jonathan
really good
Grenard was a pretty good player.
Grenard is the perfect example. Van Jefferson, Trey Grimes. I mean, you've gotten some good players.
Just one thing I just want to add just real quick, just thinking of what you said is like, I feel like nobody's really going to want to come from the portal, like these later guys like a John Grenard nowadays, other than for NFL aspirations, because you have a big platform given being, in the SEC and stuff like that. I feel like if anything, with the approach and with the talent level that's there now, these redshirt senior, redshirt junior guys with a lot of experience will only go to Florida, given the situation right now, to take that next step to the, NFL. That's just my thought. I just want to throw that in there.
Yeah, but for me, I think using the portal, it's kind of a gray area because I do feel like the defensive line, it's an area where Florida just didn't recruit well enough to start out. That was something that they had to play a lot of makeup on. But if you're relying on the portal, I feel like one thing that you can kind of play a risk with is, let's say you're a freshman, you come in, you think you're probably going to be a red shirt type of guy, to come in there, you take your year, and that's a season of, many months and weeks to where you're just practicing. Well, let's say you're a red shirt freshman or you're a sophomore, you got into some games, and then you come in the next year and you get a guy out of a portal. So you're still waiting that much longer. So I feel like that is where you heard the developmental stages of things and why a lot of these, could be such a drop off. Obviously Javon Dexter is a really good defensive lineman. That's a 5-star type of player. You're going to come in and he's going to play and he's going to make an impact. But past that, even looking at the defensive
Marshall's
line,
done well.
Jason Marshall is another guy who's done really well. But if you're relying on a lot of these portal type of guys that are going to come in, you're just hindering the development of even more of those high school types of guys. The Avery Helms, the Ethan Pounceys, the other guys there, because you're going to the portal and you're getting a defensive back, or you're going to the portal to get a defensive lineman. So I do feel like where there is a developmental process into Florida's program under Dan Mullen, I feel like you do hinder some of that development in real game type of environments by, it's a guy that's maybe a red shirt freshman, sophomore, whatever, who should be coming in and getting those valuable game snaps, but he has to wait even longer from a guy from the portal. So I feel like that just prolongs things even more.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Obviously Javon's having a big impact, playing a big role, but you talk about some of these other guys.
Everyone knew he was going to.
Jalen Humphreys, Jalen Lee, Lamar Goods, and granted, there's been in some of those cases injury situations where they weren't able to play. But I do think it kind of sends that inconsistent message, right? And I think inconsistency is probably the key word for the Dan Mullen era so far. Is there's an inconsistent level of effort given to recruiting in certain times of the year. Florida taking a vacation a week before the dead period begins. That's not something other schools are doing, and not that Florida doesn't turn it on. We've talked about some of the times that they've closed strong. Landon Josh Braun, stealing him from the last second at Georgia, closing a little bit better in that stretch leading up to early signing day. But at this level of football in college football, the SEC, you just cannot be inconsistent in that way. And I think that the patchwork portal approach in some ways also sends that message of inconsistency to your younger guys of, hey, we recruited you, but oh no, we've got a hole. We don't think you're ready yet. So we're going to bring in some guys from the portal. All of a sudden you're waiting another year. Like, to me, that's where seasons like this, you start to see them snowball because you have frustration of guys. And look, you're never going to completely avoid frustration in the locker room. You've got 100-something guys in there. You're going to have 5 to 10 guys minimum every year that are frustrated with their lack of playing time. They're frustrated with their position coach, whatever. That happens. But I do think when you have kind of that approach of it, to me, it almost comes off as like fixing things at the last second. And I think that has been reflected with the decision not to part ways with Todd Grantham last year. In my opinion, when we kind of vocalized this at the time, I thought the 2 assistants they got rid of defensively, Ron English probably, in my opinion, needed to go. I thought Torian Gray was a really good coach who's been really good everywhere he's been. He's a great recruiter. Guys like him. To me, it just felt like, such a late response, such a late passive approach to the entire organization of the program. So to me, it's not surprising that you see that kind of passive approach show up within games, or that inconsistent approach of when you go for it on 4th down, when you don't. I don't know. That was a little rambly. It just kind of clicked in my head at the time. But let's talk about real quick before we close here. Where are you guys at right now? I've said my piece. I said 2 weeks ago I thought it was past the point of no return, where I've seen it happen too many times where the fan base goes toxic and it becomes almost us versus them as far as team versus the fans. And it's not everybody, trust me. A lot of Florida players, veterans, have been through this before and know to avoid that. But to me, I thought we were too far gone 2 weeks ago. I'm still in that camp. Where are you guys at?
I'm still in the same camp. I think it's too far gone. I think the noise in the system's there. I feel like apathy has been setting in, at least from the fan base, for, the last couple of weeks. I just don't see any way this gets turned around. I just don't think at least to me, there just doesn't seem like a scenario to where that works. And, even if Dan does get another year, I feel like, Scott Strickland has kind of hitched his wagon to Dan Mullen if things don't go well, kind of like how Dan Mullen hitched his wagon to Todd Grantham last year whenever the defense was struggling. So I feel like it's past the point of no return. You would probably have a better idea, Thomas, of, maybe the talks going on behind the scenes with things, but I just don't see it, at least in my opinion, how this just turns around and just all of a sudden, starts clicking. There's just not even very many scenarios. I think, just from kind of reading things, I think Brian Kelly a couple years ago was like one of the only times where this has actually worked out and things turned around. So
at this level, for sure.
Yeah, excuse me, at this level of ball, I just don't see where this just, turns out to be positive.
Right. What's your take? Because you've been around Dan. I mean, if anybody could make a case for him, it would probably be you.
Well, first I want to mention what you just said. I think was spot on too. Torian Gray was hands down the best DB coach we had during my 5 years, and you could do a survey with every DB that played there, and they would all say Torian Gray was the best overall, scheme, technical approach coach, and best in relation to with players. But I think right now, like you guys are saying, I think, this is the time too, when you bring in those transfer portal guys, those, and you hinder the development of guys. Like, just off the top of my head, I think of like a guy like, Josiah Pierre, who I was good friends with last year. Like, this time around, unfortunately, there's going to be a group, how it's been in the past. I'm not right or wrong, but there's probably 5 to 7 guys right now that are like, they've decided they're transferring. They know they didn't get their opportunity. And, that happens with every team. But you got those guys that are going to go into the portal, and then it's like, you already don't have a ton of talent right now. So if you're losing some of those guys you're supposed to really be developing, especially when the season kind of, had turmoil, and you're not going to have a successful season, having those transfer portal guys play because of the seniority, I don't really agree with. And I be honest, I'm with you guys. I think there's way too much separation in recruiting, like between a Georgia and a Florida. And I want to be optimistic, but I really don't know what there is that Dan Mullen can do to right the ship immediately. And I don't think he has the leash right now to have, 2 more years to figure it out. I think, how Gator fans are, and just how, we deserve to have a winning program. And I know, we had a good couple of years when Dan first got here, but he seemed to have lost that culture that he brought, and people aren't buying into the system as much. And I don't really see there being a way to really right the ship. So it'll be interesting to see, and love to see what, Scott Strickland thinks of the situation, because I know he's got, huge ties with Dan. He brought him in as his, first hire, really. So it's like, it'll be interesting to see what he's going to do, because, either they're going to continue to build that relationship and the fans are going to want to know more of what's actually going on, or he's going to have to cut ties with him and do, what the fans want. And that's, get a new type of coach that's going to be, all in on recruiting, that brings in a killer staff that's going to be able to get players that come to a situation that isn't, the most appealing, given when you got Georgia and all these other teams that are dominating.
Yeah, I think, I don't know exactly where the administration stands on that. My sense from talking to people close to it, obviously I'm not talking to Scott Strickland directly, is that they've wanted for really the last couple weeks to be patient and give Dan Mullen a chance to work things out, give him a chance to change, some of the staff out, bring in, guys that can help him on the recruiting front. But I'll go back to even before the South Carolina game, the phrase that I heard used about, where Scott Strickland was at was, we just need some wins. And unfortunately, the way things have gone, the way the South Carolina game looked, Florida goes in as a 20-something point favorite, loses by 17. Samford, if you have guys locked in, you're not in a 70-52 shootout against Samford. And then last night, I thought much better from the approach, the effort standpoint. But again, that almost ends up being an indictment on where you're at in terms of the actual makeup of the roster. If you're still having all those problems, it's hard to say, okay, if they're playing pretty hard and still not getting it done against really a pretty mediocre Missouri team, what are we doing here? But I said last week on the podcast on Sunday that I thought fans just needed to be patient and let it play out. I talked about, I wasn't sure that this team would be able to rally, and that's where, there's part of me is like, the effort was much better yesterday, but overall they still weren't able to pull out a result. So I think it's probably just a matter of time, but we're not in Scott Strickland's brain. We don't know the way he's thinking. So I think we're going to have to, see it play out. I think FSU, assuming nothing happens this weekend, and at this point I'm not expecting anything to happen, it'll be interesting to see that dynamic of, you got a Florida State team that feels like it's building some positive momentum. As far as narratives and direction of the program goes, I don't think there's any way you can argue that Florida's heading in a positive direction if you were to come out and not win that game next week. So, in my opinion, yesterday probably made that decision for the administration. We'll find out. But look, Florida's opening up. I'm looking at it now as a 10-point favorite over FSU. So something's not connecting here, because no Florida fan in their right mind, I think, is going to lay money on Florida to cover that line. I know a lot of people that I talked to last week were, betting pretty significantly on Missouri money line. So something is disconnected here. I don't know exactly what it is. I don't know if the administration is quite on the same page as the fans, but we'll find out, guys. I appreciate all your thoughts, Brett. It was great getting your thoughts as somebody that's been in that locker room with Dan, with some of previous coaches in similar situations. And Blake, I appreciate all the feedback on recruiting. That'll do it for today's episode of the Swamp 24/7 podcast, guys. Appreciate you tuning in.